In the spring of 1835, a young man stood before the wreckage of his life's work in Charleston, South Carolina, silenced by a law that made the act of teaching a crime punishable by the lash. Daniel Alexander Payne did not merely witness the doors of his school being bolted shut. He witnessed an empire of the mind under siege. Yet, from the ashes of that forced exile emerged a visionary who realized that if the law would not allow a black man to teach, he would instead build a university where the law could no longer reach. This is the story of a man who transformed his personal displacement into a national blueprint for intellectual sovereignty, proving that while a classroom could be shuttered, a consecrated intellect remained the most dangerous weapon against the machinery of bondage. The life of Daniel Alexander Payne stands as a monumental testament to the transformative power of education and the unyielding pursuit of human dignity amidst the crushing machinery of American chattel slavery and systemic racism. As a bishop of the African Methodist Episcopal AME Church and the first African American to lead an institution of higher learning in the United States, Payne did not merely exist within the historical currents of the 19th century. He fundamentally rerouted them. His narrative is not simply a collection of biographical milestones, but a strategic, lifelong campaign to elevate a marginalized people through the synthesis of rigorous intellectualism and deeply felt Christian piety. Payne's legacy is rooted in the conviction that the liberation of the mind was the necessary precursor to the liberation of the soul and the body, a philosophy forged in the crucible of the antebellum South and refined through decades of leadership in the North. The genesis of Daniel Payne's worldview can be traced to the complex social landscape of Charleston, South Carolina, where he was born to free parents, London and Martha Payne, on February 24, 1811. To understand the trajectory of Payne's life, one must look at the generational resilience embedded in his family heritage. His grandfather, London Payne Sr., was the son of an Englishman who had emigrated to Massachusetts and served in the Revolutionary War. This lineage of service and migration eventually brought the family to Virginia, yet the precarious nature of Black freedom in the early Republic was illustrated by the elder London Payne's abduction into slavery. The fact that Payne's father was able to labor and eventually purchase his own freedom for the staggering sum of $1,000 instilled in the family a profound sense of the value of liberty and the necessity of sacrifice. Payne's arrival was framed as a divine consecration. His father, London, had promised the Lord that should he be granted a son, the child would be named after the prophet Daniel and dedicated to God's service. This spiritual weight was matched by a commitment to literacy. His parents personally oversaw his early instruction in reading and writing while ensuring his immersion in the Methodist weekly class meetings at Cumberland Street Methodist Episcopal Church. This dual foundation of literacy and liturgy created a framework where intellectual development and spiritual formation were inseparable. However, the stability of this environment was shattered by successive tragedies. Payne was only 4 years old when his father passed away, and by the age of 9, he was orphaned following his mother's death from consumption. The responsibility for his upbringing fell to his great-aunt, Sarah Bordeaux. Far from a period of stagnation, these years under Bordeaux's care were instrumental in shaping his internal resolve. She provided not only for his material needs but also served as a moral compass, urging him to attain a noble character, despite the limitations imposed by a slaveholding society. Payne's thirst for knowledge proved to be voracious and expansive. His formal education in Charleston was remarkably rigorous for a young man of color in the early 19th century, encompassing the study of Greek, Latin, and French. This classical training provided him with the linguistic tools to engage with the broader Western intellectual tradition. At age 18, following a profound religious conversion, Payne experienced a specific vocational epiphany, a call to dedicate his life to the education of African Americans. This was not merely a career choice, but a perceived divine mandate to use his intellectual gifts as an instrument of racial uplift. By 1829, a 19-year-old Payne established his own school in Charleston. The curriculum he designed was staggering in its breadth, including chemistry, philosophy, astronomy, botany, and zoology, alongside his continued instruction in classical languages. For Payne, education was a comprehensive endeavor intended to prove the intellectual parity of African Americans. His classroom was a radical space, serving both free and enslaved Black people, effectively challenging the ontological foundations of slavery, which relied on the perceived intellectual inferiority of the oppressed. The eventual suppression of Payne's school was not the result of personal failure, but of legislative fear. The success of educated Black individuals was viewed by the white power structure as a direct threat to the stability of the slave system. On April 1, 1835, the South Carolina General Assembly passed Act No. 2639. This draconian law criminalized the instruction of any slave or free person of color in reading or writing. The penalties were designed to be both financially and physically ruinous. White transgressors faced fines and imprisonment, while free persons of color and enslaved people were subject to fines and brutal corporal punishment, specifically 50 lashes. The closure of his school on March 31, 1835, triggered a profound existential and spiritual crisis for Payne. He found himself sleepless, loaded with disappointment, and struggling with a deepening crisis of faith. He questioned the very existence and justice of a God who would permit such blatant institutionalized evil to triumph over a mission he believed was divinely ordained. This period of doubting was a pivotal moment in his theological development. He was ultimately forced to conclude that his mission could not be fulfilled within the confines of the South. His departure for New York shortly thereafter was more than a relocation. It was a strategic retreat that allowed him to seek the theological credentials necessary to challenge the system of slavery from a position of ecclesiastical authority. The transition from the restricted atmosphere of Charleston to the intellectual centers of the North represented a strategic shift in Payne's methodology for racial advancement. Upon arriving in New York in 1835, Payne carried with him letters of introduction that facilitated his entry into a network of influential abolitionist clergy. This migration was not merely a flight from oppression, but a deliberate quest for the ecclesiastical standing required to challenge the moral foundations of American slavery. His arrival in the North positioned him to acquire the formal theological training that he recognized as a necessary prerequisite for leadership in a society that looked to the pulpit for moral and social guidance. Payne's subsequent enrollment in the Lutheran Theological Seminary at Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, remains one of the most intriguing chapters of his life. His decision to study under the tutelage of Samuel Simon Schmucker, a leading figure in American Lutheranism and a staunch abolitionist, demonstrated Payne's pragmatic approach to cross-denominational alliance. At Gettysburg, Payne was the only student of color, a position that required immense psychological fortitude. The curriculum provided him with a systematic grounding in theology, biblical exegesis, and homiletics, further sharpening an already formidable intellect. He was not merely absorbing information, he was constructing a theological defense of human equality. The mechanism of Payne's development during this period is found in his synthesis of Lutheran pietism and his own Methodist roots. He found in Lutheranism a profound emphasis on the priesthood of all believers, and a rigorous approach to doctrine that complemented his own discipline. In 1837, Payne achieved a historic milestone by becoming the first African American ordained by the Frankian Synod of the Evangelical Lutheran Church. This ordination provided him with a recognized platform from which to speak against the peculiar institution of the South. However, Payne's time in the Lutheran Church was marked by a growing realization regarding the limitations of white-led denominations in addressing the specific needs of the Black community. While he deeply valued the education he received, he perceived a disconnect between the abstract theological debates of the seminary and the lived reality of his people. His brief tenure as a pastor in Troy, New York, where he served a Presbyterian congregation, further illustrated his denominational fluidity, yet it also underscored his search for a spiritual home that would allow for the full expression of Black agency. The catalyst behind his eventual departure from Lutheranism and return to Methodism was rooted in his conviction that an independent Black church was the only vehicle capable of fostering genuine racial self-determination. He recognized that while individual white allies were valuable, the collective empowerment of African Americans required institutions owned, operated, and directed by Black hands. In 1841, Daniel Payne made the momentous decision to join the African Methodist Episcopal AME Church, a move that would define the remainder of his life and reshape the denomination. His entry into the AME Church was characterized by a specific, urgent mission: the intellectual elevation of the clergy. At the time, the AME Church, though a beacon of independence, was divided over the necessity of formal education for its ministers. Many traditionalists feared that book learning would stifle the fire of the Spirit and distance the leadership from the common people. Payne's arrival acted as a catalyst for a decades-long internal struggle over the identity of the church. He argued that an ignorant ministry was a liability to the race and a dishonor to God. To Payne, the methodology of spiritual leadership required a marriage of burning zeal and enlightened reason. He did not view education as a replacement for divine inspiration, but as the vessel that contained and directed it. His advocacy was often met with fierce resistance. He was at times mocked and viewed with suspicion by those who felt his classical training and formal demeanor were elitist. Despite this opposition, Payne's influence grew through his prolific writing and his appointment as the church's historiographer. In 1848, he was tasked with writing the history of the African Methodist Episcopal Church, a project that allowed him to frame the denomination's narrative not just as a religious movement, but as a central pillar of Black civilization. By documenting the church's origins and its founders, like Richard Allen, Payne provided the denomination with a sense of historical continuity and a clear trajectory for future growth. The depth of his commitment was further evidenced by his successful push for the education rule during the General Conference of 1844. This mandate required candidates for the ministry to undergo a specific course of study before ordination. This was a revolutionary shift in the church's internal policy. Payne's persistence stemmed from his belief that if Black people were to demand their rights in a republic that prized reason and law, their leaders must be capable of articulating those demands with the same sophistication as their oppressors. During this period, Payne's personal life was also marked by profound transitions and domestic tragedies that tested his resolve. His first marriage to Julia Ferris in 1847 ended in heartbreak when she died less than a year later during childbirth. The infant daughter she bore survived only 9 months. This recurrence of loss, reminiscent of his childhood, did not lead to despair, but seemed to further sanctify his devotion to his public work. He eventually found a lifelong partner in Eliza Clark, whom he married in 1853, establishing a stable domestic foundation for the monumental tasks that lay ahead in the following decade. The year 1852 marked a definitive shift in the scale of Payne's influence when he was elected the 6th bishop of the African Methodist Episcopal Church. This elevation was not merely a recognition of his seniority, but a mandate to implement his vision of a literary and religious reformation across the entire denomination. As a bishop, Payne gained the administrative authority to oversee the intellectual standards of the various conferences, but his most significant contribution during this decade would involve the physical and institutional grounding of Black higher education. The justification behind Payne's obsession with institution building lay in the precarious nature of Black intellectual life in the mid-19th century. While some northern universities admitted students of color, these students remained guests in spaces they did not control. Payne recognized that for African Americans to achieve true parity, they required an intellectual mecca, a space where Black scholarship was the norm rather than the exception. This realization led to the most audacious gamble of his career, the acquisition of Wilberforce University. In 1856, the Methodist Episcopal Church, the predominantly white northern branch, established Wilberforce University in Ohio, primarily to educate the children of white planters and the free Black population. However, by the early 1860s, the school was floundering due to the financial and social upheavals of the Civil War. When the white trustees decided to close the school and sell the property in 1863, Payne acted with a decisiveness that bordered on the prophetic. Despite having no liquid capital and facing a church treasury depleted by the war, he personally signed a note for $10,000 to purchase the institution for the AME Church. The execution of this acquisition was a masterclass in faith-based fiscal management. Payne did not rely on large endowments, which were non-existent for Black institutions at the time, but rather on the power of the pennies. He mobilized the entire AME denomination, turning every congregation into a fundraising engine. This effort transformed Wilberforce into the first college in the United States to be owned and operated by African Americans. By becoming its president, a position he held for 13 years, Payne became the first Black person to lead a university in America. He didn't just manage the school, he curated its culture, demanding a standard of excellence that challenged the prevailing skepticism of the era regarding Black intellectual capacity. The backdrop of the American Civil War provided the ultimate proving ground for Payne's belief in the providential role of the AME Church. While the war raged, Payne was not a passive observer. He was a diplomat and a strategist. In 1862, he famously met with President Abraham Lincoln to advocate for the emancipation of enslaved people in the District of Columbia. This meeting was a significant moment in the rationale for Payne's political engagement. He understood that the church's moral authority must be leveraged to influence the halls of secular power. As Union lines moved south, Payne saw an unprecedented opportunity for the recovery of the South. He viewed the AME Church as a liberating force that followed the Union Army to provide spiritual and educational infrastructure to the newly emancipated. In May 1865, Payne returned to his birthplace, Charleston, aboard the steamship Oceanus. This return was deeply symbolic. 30 years after being forced out of the city by laws that criminalized his school, he returned as a conquering prelate to establish the South Carolina Conference of the AME Church. The logistics of this expansion was systematic. Payne did not just plant churches, he planted schools. He understood that the millions of freedmen were entering a world where literacy was the primary currency of citizenship. Under his guidance, the AME Church became one of the most significant providers of education in the Reconstruction South. He dispatched missionaries who were often as much teachers as they were preachers. However, this period also introduced new complexities into Payne's mission. He encountered a cultural divide between the educated Northern AME leadership and the ecstatic, often illiterate religious traditions of the Southern freedmen. Payne, a proponent of orderly and refined worship, found himself in conflict with the ring shout and other traditional West African-influenced religious expressions. His insistence on correct liturgical forms was driven by his desire to protect the church from being dismissed as heathenish by white critics, yet it occasionally created a friction between his classical ideals and the vibrant, lived spirituality of the Southern masses. Despite these internal tensions, Payne's leadership during Reconstruction ensured that the AME Church became the largest and most influential independent Black organization in the United States. He successfully bridged the gap between the antebellum struggle for freedom and the post-war struggle for civil rights, always anchoring the movement in the dual pillars of the Bible and the textbook. The final decades of Payne's life were characterized by an expansion of his horizon beyond the American landscape, as he sought to position the AME Church within the broader context of global Christianity and the international struggle for human rights. By the late 1870s, Payne had become the elder statesman of Black Methodism, a figure whose moral authority was recognized by ecclesiastical leaders on both sides of the Atlantic. The driving force for his international engagement was rooted in his desire to dismantle the provincialism that often hampered racial progress. He believed that the African American struggle was a specific manifestation of a universal quest for justice. In 1881, Payne traveled to London to participate in the First Ecumenical Methodist Conference. This was not merely a symbolic journey, but a strategic opportunity to showcase the intellectual and organizational maturity of the AME Church. By engaging with Methodist leaders from across the globe, Payne demonstrated that the Black Church was not a peripheral sect, but a central player in the global Wesleyan movement. The instrumentality of his influence during this period was primarily through his sophisticated oratory and his ability to harmonize the specific grievances of Black Americans with broader Christian ethics. His presence in London challenged the prevailing Victorian assumptions about the inherent limitations of people of African descent, providing a living refutation of scientific racism. Back in the United States, Payne's later years were dedicated to the meticulous preservation of history. He understood that a people without a documented past are more easily subjugated in the present. In 1888, he published Recollections of 70 Years, an autobiography that served as both a personal memoir and a blueprint for future generations of Black leaders. Following this, in 1891, he completed his magnum opus, The History of the African Methodist Episcopal Church. The mechanics of these scholarly contributions involved decades of painstaking data collection, the archiving of conference minutes, and the conducting of interviews. Through these works, Payne ensured that the agency of Black religious leaders would not be erased by the revisionist histories of the post-Reconstruction era. The culmination of Daniel Alexander Payne's public life occurred in 1893, the final year of his earthly journey. Despite his advanced age and failing health, he traveled to Chicago to represent the AME Church at the World's Parliament of Religions, held in conjunction with the World's Columbian Exposition. This event was the first formal gathering of representatives from Eastern and Western spiritual traditions, and Payne's participation was a crowning achievement for his lifelong pursuit of institutional recognition. At the Parliament, Payne presided over the African Methodist Episcopal Church Day. His presence there served as a final, powerful testament to his driving conviction, the insistence that African Americans be granted a seat at the table of global civilization. He spoke not as a former victim of Southern restrictive laws, but as a bishop of a global church and a former university president. He used this platform to articulate a vision of Christianity that was inherently anti-racist and intellectually rigorous. Daniel Alexander Payne passed away on November 20th, 1893, in Jacksonville, Florida. His death marked the end of an era, but his influence was already deeply embedded in the DNA of Black American life. The manifestation of his enduring legacy can be seen in the survival and growth of Wilberforce University and the continued emphasis on a learned ministry within the AME Church. He successfully navigated the transition of his people from the house of bondage to the house of knowledge, proving through his own life that the most effective weapon against systemic oppression is a mind that refuses to be shackled. Payne's life stands as a bridge between the era of the revolutionary founders and the burgeoning civil rights movements of the early 20th century. He was a man who understood that true freedom is never merely granted by legislation. It must be cultivated through the rigorous development of the character and the intellect. In the synthesis of his deep faith and his uncompromising scholarship, Daniel Payne created a model for leadership that continues to challenge and inspire. The life of Daniel Alexander Payne serves as a powerful reminder that history is not a static collection of dates, but a living force capable of dismantling chains and building civilizations. His journey from a shuttered schoolhouse in Charleston to the presidency of a university demonstrates that when deep faith is wedded to rigorous intellectual pursuit, the result is a transformative power that can reshape the world. As you reflect on Payne's commitment to the liberation of the mind and the soul, consider how the echoes of the past still resonate in the challenges of our modern age. Are you prepared to explore the forgotten narratives and pivotal events that have paved the way for our present understanding of faith and justice? Join a community of thinkers, scholars, and believers dedicated to unearthing the profound lessons of history. Subscribe to Theology today, where we delve deep into the stories and events of the past to find the wisdom necessary to navigate our future. Together, let us explore the legacies of those who, like Bishop Payne, used the weight of history to anchor a vision of hope.